And so, yes, first of all, very brief introduction. I'm a senior lecturer at King's College London, and I'm here, as you see from the slide and from the title that was available on the web, to give you a brief history of this prototype mechanical ventilator that was developed for COVID-19. And it was developed, as you see at the top, between King's College London and the University of Oxford. And then based on that work, a social enterprise for mechanical ventilation was started called OxVent. And as I'd like to point out straight away here on my first slide is that I'm the one who's speaking here because we thought it would be a bit of a challenge to have 90 people all saying something, but the work that I'm presenting has been done by a very large team that developed in a very short period of time. And I refer you here to the OxVent website where you can see everyone listed. So it's just an honor for me and a pleasure to present all these large and incredibly skilled groups' work. And so yeah, thank you for this opportunity to present this work. And it's great to follow from the previous talks and also the videos on topics that are very much close to our own research areas in terms of responses to hypoxia and technology for the intensive care unit. So our story starts on the 16th of March when the UK government started the so-called Ventilator Challenge UK. What happened at the time was that in mid-March, some modeling forecasted the need for several thousand ventilators for the intensive care unit in the UK within a month. Now, it takes a relatively long time to manufacture standard ventilators, the ones that are used by patients now in the intensive care unit in the UK. And as a consequence, even at maximum capacity, it is impossible to achieve that number of ventilators, to manufacture that number of ventilators in that short period of time. So as a consequence, the UK government put out this call and asked anyone who could help achieving this challenging target of manufacturing several thousand ventilators in a month. And the MHRA, bottom right corner, provided a couple of days before the 16th of March, the guidelines for the requirements for these ventilators, at least the requirements in mid-March. And they set out the parameters that these ventilators needed to meet and a testing process that involved some testing on the bench and some testing directly in the hospital, skipping the animal testing, preclinical testing, which is typical in other processes or is generally performed by most medical devices before a medical device is used in a patient. And on that day, everything started with a PhD student at Oxford who emailed their supervisor saying, we're engineers, shouldn't we try to do something about this ventilator challenge? And that's where it all started, with this Rob Starrock emailing his supervisor, Mark Thompson. And Mark emails one of my colleagues and ex-supervisors, Professor Andrew Farmery, who's an anesthetist, because I say the engineers can make a ventilator themselves, but then when you take it to the clinical setting, unless the engineer knows what the medics need, then it may be little useful. And then by combining the engineering with the clinical expertise, the team could make something which is useful and works. But there's still something missing, which we needed in the team, which was somebody expert in the regulatory process, because we can have a helpful ventilator that works well, but that we cannot use because it's not allowed by the MHRA, by the regulatory body. And so within a week, we put together a team that included engineers in the background, Rob Starrock and Andrew Orr, that we'll see later in a video, Professor Farmery on his knees, jotting down the technical drawings of what he was seeing as the potential design for the ventilator, and me in the obviously less intellectual role of taking pictures here. And you see we're nicely masked here, and we're at the 21st of March, so just a few days after the call was launched. And this is the biomedical engineering workshop where almost all the work took place at the time. And Within a few days, we had submitted our proposal to the UK government for this scheme, which received 5,000 proposals and shortlisted, I think, around, I can't remember how many shortlisted, but through these interview process on the 23rd of March, which we were called to join, it shortlisted only 8 projects for prototype ventilators that did not exist 1 week before. There was no design, no anything a week before. And I think another 8 projects that were building on existing ventilators that had not received regulatory approval, but existed a week or a year before. They just needed some tweaking or improvements. And you can tell here, we should say that there's no masks wearing. We're reasonably socially distanced, but I guess by now we know we could have improved our our attitude in this presentation. But I'll play for a moment what the group had achieved by then. And at this stage, it was a group of around 40 to 45 individuals. By working almost essentially day and night in the bioengineering workshop and in offices at computers here and there. And I'll leave Andrew Orr to give this very brief presentation of the system that was developed from scratch within a week and was then presented to the Cabinet Office on the 23rd of March.
Allow me to present the OxVent. This system takes in standard 4-bar air, here supplied by a canister, but available as standard in all NHS hospitals. This comes through a small solenoid valve with an electronic control system, more on that later, and is driven into this box. Inside the box is a standard ambulance bag. These bags are normally compressed by hand to provide air to a patient, but in this case we compress it using the pressure from our air supply. This is then used to ventilate the patient, and a valve allows the patient's lungs to relax. As you can see, here they are inflating to quite a large tidal volume, but we might want to change that. A primary care practitioner has some very simple options for controlling this. There are 3 key parameters they're interested in: the tidal volume, the respiratory rate in breaths per minute, and the I/E ratio, respectively controlled by these 3 knobs and set by these 3 buttons. To set a new value, in this case I'm going to decrease the tidal volume from 450-ish to around 400. You push the button to set it, and that is reflected here. As we can see now, the bag is compressed less, and the lungs inflate less also. Likewise, I'm going to now use the box to increase the rate. We're now at 17 breaths per minute. And lastly, I'm going to use the box to set an I/E ratio of 1 to 2, compared to the 1 to 1 that we started this demonstration with.
Right, so this video and the information we provided at the interview to the Cabinet Office seemed to be successful in that we were shortlisted by then to be supported by the UK government to develop this ventilator with the NHS infrastructure in mind, so that it could be used the following month in the UK hospitals. Obviously, as I'm neither an engineer nor a clinician, but I'm Italian, one of my roles was to liaise with the politicians. And as we were supported by government, I thought that we succeeded in that part of the work as well. Now, those were the good times. We had lots of support, including here on the right, the Queen's helicopter, that because everything was done at the fastest pace I've ever come across in a research project, the Queen kindly lended her helicopter to take some technical components from the south of England up to Hull, where by then our team was merged or joined with the Smith & Nephew team. And that was a very fundamental change in the project, in that, as Paul Goulart, one of the engineers in the project, says, university researchers are very good at making one thing. If then you need to make 5,000 of these things, they're not in the best position to do that. And that is when the government joined our project with Smith & Nephew. By then, there was an improvement, a change in the design in terms of how the components were put together. We've seen that a core component called here the ventilator box, where there's this adult manual resuscitator, which instead of being operated by an individual's hand, it's compressed by compressed air at 4 bar, the air supply, which is available in the NHS hospitals. And the air supply is controlled by solenoid valves. And there's an oxygen sensor here, as we can in this design increase the fraction of inspired oxygen. And then there's a couple of filters, one here by the ventilator, one by the patient for obvious reasons. And then in the system, there's a PEEP valve to retain some of the pressure in the lung of the patient when the patient breathes out. And there's a control box at the top, which sets the timing of the breathing, how many breaths per minute are delivered, how large each breath is, how long it takes to breathe in compared with breathing out, and so forth. And the key points of our proposal for this ventilator was that it was simple, it was safe, and scalable. It was simple in terms of manufacturing and operation. So we're at the time when all the ventilator manufacturers are competing for a number of same components. We cannot compete for the same components. So the design was made in a way that we could use off-the-shelf components with their advantages and disadvantages, but they were definitely all available so that we could purchase 5,000 of each component, as the government told us we were asked to manufacture 5,000 units. It was safe. It was developed to ventilate in volume control mode. So we set a given volume of gas that is delivered to the patient at each breath, and that was the main principle. And you see in the top right, the analogy we presented that was suggested by one of our colleagues who had worked for many years at Medtronic, Professor Tim Dennison at Oxford. The analogy was with Medtronic's first external heart pacemaker. It was simple, but it kept people alive. And the final thing is that this design was scalable. When we had our meetings with on Zoom with 40 faces here and there from all the projects and politicians and so on, each of us were asking, how many ventilators can you actually make and when are they becoming available? And within the UK Ventilator Challenge, our project was the only one that could have manufactured 5,000 ventilators in a week. Other projects that were coming up, we say, well, we can deliver like 100 in June or 300 in July and so on. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the only design that could actually be manufactured in this large scale. And the credit for that goes all to the colleagues at Smith & Nephew in Hull, in that they set up the manufacturing line and the verification protocols to enable this scalability, which the university would have not been able to achieve on its own. This is just an image of the ventilator. And here we see it a little bit in action on the left. I'll just reduce the volume. You can only hear the noise it makes. And on the right, we see that, so results from bench testing. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but we see that we had a target volume of air that we wanted the ventilator to deliver to the patient. And what was measured by a monitoring system independent of the ventilator showed that there was a very linear relationship between the target and delivered volumes. And here we are at the 25th of April. So it's a month later, and you see that the design has changed in terms of the way things look. There's instructions on the front of the ventilator, because we're still thinking that this ventilator is going to be used by not necessarily trained individuals. And we only have two buttons. One is to select things, one is to adjust parameters like how large this volume that we deliver to the patient may be, how many breaths per minute, and so forth. And this is just an overview of what we can set with this ventilator. There's two ventilator modes. One is where we determine the volume that is delivered at each breath, and it is delivered at a set respiratory rate. So there's a set number of breaths that are delivered per minute. And it's in contrast with the other option, which is assist control volume. And in that option, an inspiratory pressure from the patient, which is measured in the system with a drop in the pressure in the system, is the one that triggers the delivery of a breath. And so this ventilator offers both ventilation modes. And then the ranges for the tidal volume, the respiratory rate, and pressures that are limited. These may also be determined by the regulator in terms of delivering pressures that are not dangerous for the patients, obviously. And this is where we got towards the end of April. You can see there's a large team. There's individuals from Oxford who went to Hull, and they were sort of married men hugging each other. It was a very intense time. Testing being performed on the same monitors or dummy lungs and patients as the MHRA was using for their process. And then on the 28th of April, for the second time, this ventilator was going for independent MHRA testing, following an initial testing where a few things need adjusting. 28th April, I think around lunchtime, this box goes to a place in Birmingham for independent testing, which, as it was demonstrated later, had passed all the essential criteria, pending two that had been fixed in the following few days. But by then, the UK Ventilator Challenge on the 28th of April in the evening at the 5 p.m. news was closed. It was closed for all prototypes, all the projects, and bear in mind by then there was all the bill of material available at the company to manufacture these 5,000 ventilators. And I don't know about the other projects, but only I think a few of the projects that were based on pre-existing ventilators were supported further. And it was a bit of a frustration moment for the team in terms of not seeing the device approved by the MHRA, but it was also a nice moment in that we saw that the number of cases was not as high as it had been forecasted, at least here in the UK. And being a wealthy Western country, there was plenty of very expensive ventilators that could be used. And I understand from my clinical colleagues that that is still the case now, even though unfortunately the numbers are not what we had expected in April and May last year. Then one thing that was not done yet was some preclinical testing. And as we all learned last year at some point that several countries around the world don't have mechanical ventilation capacity almost at all. Then one step that we wanted to go through was some preclinical testing to demonstrate the performance of the ventilator in ventilating an animal. So a group of 3 of us went from London to Uppsala, where we've been collaborating with our colleagues for many years. And we did that. We left on the 3rd of June. And you see here in the car, it says a British COVID outfit, but actually there's an Italian, somebody from Northern Ireland, Doug Crockett, and a Mexican, Carla Fuentes Lopez, at the back. And when we arrived in Sweden that evening, it was a bit shocking because this is how we arrived. This is how we were going around. And we arrived in Uppsala, and this was the Swedish COVID days. So people were sort of enjoying a cup of a beer or a coffee in the sun, just as if nothing had happened. And I must say that not long afterwards, and certainly not surprisingly, the Swedish king said that the coronavirus approach had failed, and it wasn't a necessary surprise for us. But here we had an initial setback in that we had liaised with our colleagues. This is the gas supply we need. This is what the connector looks like. We sent each other pictures. It looks the same. And then we get to the point of connecting the 2 cables and didn't fit. There's a tiny difference that cannot be seen with the naked eye, but the two ends don't match. Fortunately, as we had done experiments here before, there were adapters so that the pipe that comes out from the Swedish hospital could be connected with the pipe that goes into our ventilator. And it was a long evening. I finished setting up the lab at around 2 in the morning, and this is what the lab looked like with our power lab. There were 2 of them. One of them was very kindly offered by ADInstruments with a notice of a few days when we said, well, we've got to go to Uppsala to do the experiments. We only have 1 power lab, we need 2. And our colleagues in Oxford here from ADInstruments very kindly got everything together and allowed us to perform these measurements. And this is just for you to have a look at in case you haven't been in Uppsala. 2 a.m. in the morning in early June, it's not that dark at all. So this was on my way to get a few hours of sleep before starting our work at 7 the next day. And here there's a little video that I'll play, and it shows very briefly some of the measurements that we were performing. And at this stage, lab charts taking in signals from Power Lab, and the signals come from respiratory monitors that show the airway pressure at the top and the airway flow in the second line, and then there's oxygen and carbon dioxide values and so on, and some calculated parameters further down. But what we see here is an example of an animal study where the animal was ventilated with a given respiratory rate. And then we went from the mandatory ventilation to the spontaneous breathing ventilation. And you see here that the animal was triggering a more rapid respiratory rate during this part of the experiment here. And then that was taken over again by mandatory ventilation later on. This is just to give you a flavor for what we were recording at the time. And some measurements went better than other ones. And these I won't go over the details, just to briefly show you a few results in terms of what was measured for inspiration and expiration in terms of flow. Mostly what we expected, in that for a volume controlled ventilation, we want a relatively constant flow during inspiration. And then during expiration, one of the things that has been improved since was that you see at the end of expiration, there's still some residual flow, and that is not desirable in mechanical ventilators because it could be an issue with the patient. And so if the ventilator does not show some residual flow, it's not clear whether it's the ventilator or the patient from a clinical perspective. And the end expiratory pressure was reasonably within the target range, a bit lower than we had said. Certainly one of the successes was taking 3 cakes through the security control in Sweden. But then, as I mentioned, several countries don't have enough ventilators, and here's an example for Mexico, a forecast at the time in November, where they forecasted that in February 2021, we'd need around 12,000 ventilators. And in a way, unfortunately, the values were confirmed. These ones are 2 traces. Maybe many of us in Europe know that Italy's not been doing great recently. And you see that for 100,000 people, there's a much greater need of ICU beds and here invasive ventilators in Mexico. So in that sense, the OxVent project is considering still potential application for use of these mechanical ventilator in low and middle income countries, but also we've all become aware of the need for mechanical ventilation in low middle income countries beyond COVID-19, for example, to enable access to surgery. And in this sense, to finish off, what needs doing is a clinical evaluation of the effectiveness of this ventilator. Is it as good as the standard ventilators to ventilate some COVID patients? Is it not? Something that has not been done for any of these prototypes, is it better than no ventilation? Because that is the scenario that many patients face. We're doing, in terms of future development, we're doing a survey to understand what infrastructure a ventilator needs to meet, the requirements for which it needs to meet. Building partnerships with manufacturers. Clearly, we need to work through regulatory authorization. At the moment, we are undergoing FDA emergency use authorization in the US and COFEPRIS in Mexico. And we're looking for funding to support this further development. That's it for me. I'm hoping that I presented something that was matching your expectations. And I'd be delighted to take any questions or elaborate on any points that may have not been clear. But thank you very much for listening for now.
Excellent. It was really, really great to hear about your journey developing the OxVent. Thank you for this presentation, Federico. So as for the previous presentation, you can use a Q&A at the bottom, and we do have a question in the chat. Federico, if you want to click on here.
Or it's just a second. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Oh, it's a comment. Thank you, Lucy. Yeah.
We're going to give a few moments for people to eventually type a question in the Q&A tab or to raise their hand to ask a question. And in the meantime, if you would be happy to share with us perhaps what were your best moments and maybe the worst as well during this project, that would be great to hear that.
Yeah. Can you see me? And is this my PowerPoint slides here? Yeah. Okay, that's great. Yeah, and so yeah, well, best and worst. That's a question we get often. I think the worst I mentioned for the team in that 28th of April was when people literally had just slept for 3 to 4 hours for many days in Hull, both our team and the Smith and Nephew team, and not only, but the ventilator had gone through the initial round of testing. And a few things needed adjusting, and then that day the ventilator had gone for the second round of testing. So the main point is, in my opinion, the sort of disappointment is that it was probably wise to have a design of a ventilator which is approved by the MHRA, and it's there in a folder for whenever we may need, again, very many ventilators in a short period of time, and conclude that regulatory approval process, rather than just closing it for each of and all of the projects, regardless of whether a project had not even started any testing at all, whether they started and failed everything, or whether, like in our case, we started, we went back again, and it was rather promising. In that sense, I'll just show you one slide here, just to present evidence. As a scientist, I need to present evidence, and this is the list of things that the testing site was looking at. And you see, I think there's 25 of them, and there's only 2 in red, where the unit life of the bag that we compressed was following this testing here at the end of April was confirmed to be more than 3 weeks. And the PEEP valve, it was just a matter of clarifying and writing what the problem is. So it's just to show that we had gone through a lot of testing, and it went well. So yeah, the happiest was in seeing how when there is a necessity for humanity, so many people gave everything up and focused and offered their skills to work on this project. And not only whenever we asked, everyone was happy to help, but we even got people who proactively got in contact, even too many, for a few weeks that we couldn't manage. So that was one of the most humbling and most pleasant aspects of the work. Yeah. The ventilators come in different sizes. Could this be adopted for pediatric uses? And there was some pressure sensing in the device for the assisted mode. Would it be possible to administer ventilation in pressure mode as a noise? Yeah, okay. So can this ventilator be used for pediatric use? I do not think it is. And the reason for that is in the respiratory rate that it can develop. So if we look at this slide here, we see that the maximum respiratory rate, the respiratory rate range is from 10 to 30 breaths per minute. And my understanding is that in pediatric scenarios, we need more than 30 breaths per minute, and possibly maybe also smaller tidal volumes. This design does not work in pressure control mode. It is one of the, it is especially, I think, in Europe, it's a preferred mode of ventilation, but this current design does not deliver pressure control ventilation. And Rebecca, is there currently ongoing projects to develop and distribute the OxVent in low-middle income countries? Yes, so at the moment, with the capacity we had in the group, we had to focus on one. And the choice ended up with Mexico. The reasons for that choice are that Mexico is a large country. The COFEPRIS, it's the MHRA equivalent in Mexico. The requirements of COFEPRIS very much overlapped with the UK requirements. So there were no major ventilator design changes, if any at all, actually, very minor. And there's a large population, there's technical, the infrastructure is similar, and there's technical capacity to use the ventilators. So there are individuals trained to use ventilators. So those were the reasons for which we focused on Mexico. We're liaising, OxVent as a social enterprise is liaising with manufacturers also in Uruguay and India. But those, to the best of my knowledge, are not as advanced as in Mexico, where there is a manufacturer with which we are working closely. Yeah.